Boudica was a queen of the British ISNI tribe who led an uprising against the occupying forces of the Roman Empire. Boudica's husband Prasutagus ruled as a nominally independent ally of Rome and left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman emperor in his will. However, when he died his will was ignored, and the kingdom was annexed. Boudica was flogged, her daughters raped, and Roman financiers called in their loans. In AD 60 or 61, when the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was campaigning on the island of Anglesey off the northwest coast of Wales, Boudica led the ISNI, the Trinovantes, and others in revolt. They destroyed Camulodunum, earlier the capital of the Trinovantes but at that time a colonia, a settlement for discharged Roman soldiers and site of a temple to the former Emperor Claudius. Upon hearing of the revolt, Suetonius hurried to Londinium, the 20-year-old commercial settlement that was the rebels' next target. The Romans, having concluded that they lacked sufficient numbers to defend the settlement, evacuated and abandoned Londinium. Boudica led 100,000 ISNI, Trinovantes, and others to fight Legio IX Hispana, and burned and destroyed Londinium, and Verulamium. An estimated 70,000–80,000 Romans and British were killed in the three cities by those led by Boudica. Suetonius, meanwhile, regrouped his forces in the West Midlands, and despite being heavily outnumbered defeated the Britons in the Battle of Watling Street. The crisis caused the Emperor Nero to consider withdrawing all Roman forces from Britain, but Suetonius' eventual victory over Boudica confirmed Roman control of the province. Boudica then either killed herself, so she would not be captured, or fell ill and died. The extant sources, Tacitus and Cassius Dio, differ. Interest in these events revived in the English Renaissance and led to Boudica's fame in the Victorian era. Boudica has remained an important cultural symbol in the United Kingdom. However, the absence of native British literature during the early part of the first millennium means that knowledge of Boudica's rebellion comes solely from the writings of the Romans. History. Boudica's name Boudica has been known by several versions of her name. Raphael Holinshead calls her Boudica, while Edmund Spenser calls her Bunduca, a version of the name that was used in the popular Jacobean play Bonduca, in 1612. William Cooper's poem, Boadicea, an ode popularized an alternative version of the name. From the 19th century and much of the late 20th century, Boadicea was the most common version of the name, which is probably derived from a mistranscription when a manuscript of Tacitus was copied in the Middle Ages. Her name was clearly spelled Boudica in the best manuscripts of Tacitus, but also Beta Omicron Upsilon Delta Omicron Upsilon Iota Kappa Alpha, Beta Omicron Upsilon Nu Delta Omicron Upsilon Iota Kappa Alpha, and Beta Omicron Delta Omicron Upsilon Iota Kappa Alpha in the Epitome of Cassius Dio. The name is attested in inscriptions as Boudica in Lusitania, Boudica in Bordeaux, and Boudica in Algeria. Kenneth Jackson concludes, based on later development of Welsh and Irish, that the name derives from the Proto-Celtic feminine adjective *Boudica. Victorious, that in turn is derived from the Celtic word *Buda, victory, Buaitich, Welsh Budagoliath, and that the correct speaking of the name in Common Brittonic is Boudica, pronounced Boudica. The closest English equivalent to the vowel in the first syllable is the ow in bow and arrow. The modern English pronunciation is Boudica, and it has been suggested that the most comparable English name, in meaning only, would be Victoria. Background. Tacitus and Cassius Dio agree that Boudica was of royal descent. Dio describes her as possessed of greater intelligence than often belongs to women. He also describes her as tall, with tawny hair hanging down to below her waist, a harsh voice and a piercing glare. He notes that she habitually wore a large golden necklace, a colorful tunic, and a thick cloak fastened by a brooch. Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, was the king of the ISNI, a people who inhabited roughly what is now Norfolk. The ISNI initially voluntarily allied with Rome following Claudius's conquest of southern Britain AD 43. They were proud of their independence, and had revolted in AD 47 when the then Roman governor Publius Ostorius Scapula planned to disarm all the peoples in the area of Britain under Roman control following a number of local uprisings. Ostorius defeated them and went on to put down other uprisings around Britain. The ISNI remained independent. Tacitus first mentioned Prasutagus when he wrote about Boudica's rebellion. We do not know whether he became the king after the mentioned defeat of the ISNI. We do not have any record as to whether the ISNI at that point were still Roman allies or had become a client kingdom. Tacitus wrote, the Icenian king Prasutagus, celebrated for his long prosperity, had named the emperor his heir, together with his 2 daughters, an act of deference which he thought would place his kingdom and household beyond the risk of injury. The result was contrary, so much so that his kingdom was pillaged by centurions, his household by slaves, as though they had been prizes of war. He added that Boudica was lashed and her 2 daughters were raped and that the estates of the leading ISNI men were confiscated. Cassius Dio wrote, an excuse for the war was found in the confiscation of the sums of money that Claudius had given to the foremost Britons. For these sums, as Decius Catus, the procurator of the island, maintained, were to be paid back. He also said that another reason was the fact that Seneca, in the hope of receiving a good rate of interest, had lent to the islanders 40 million sesterces that they did not want, and had afterwards called in this loan all at once and had resorted to severe measures in exacting it. Tacitus did not say why Prasutagus, or naming the emperor as his heir as well as his daughters, was meant to avert the risk of injury. He did not explain why the Romans pillaged the kingdom, why they took the lands of the chiefs, or why Boudica was flogged and her daughters were raped. Cassius Dio did not mention any of this. He said that the cause of the rebellion was the decision of the procurator of Britain and Seneca to call in Prasutagus' debts and the harsh measures which were taken to collect them. Tacitus does not mention these events. However, he wrote, alarmed by this disaster and by the fury of the province which he had goaded into war by his rapacity, the procurator Catus crossed over into Gaul. It has to be noted that this was happening while the governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was away fighting in North Wales. We do not know whether he approved of these actions. We do not know who the centurions who pillaged the kingdom were and who sent them. The text of Cassius Dio seems to suggest that Seneca, who was a private citizen, was responsible for the violence. It is unlikely that a legion was sent to land of the ISNI, as 2 of them were fighting at the island of Anglesey and the other 2 were stationed at their garrisons. Tacitus said that it was against the veterans that their hatred was most intense. For these new settlers in the colony of Camulodunum drove people out of their houses, ejected them from their farms, called them captives and slaves. This could raise the possibility that it was the retired veterans who might have been called on to or hired to intervene in the kingdom of the ISNI, and may help to account for the extent of the violence and abuse. Boudica's uprising in AD 60 or 61, while the current governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was leading a campaign against the island of Mona in the north of Wales, which was a refuge for British rebels and a stronghold of the Druids. The ISNI conspired with their neighbours, the Trinovantes, amongst others, to revolt. Boudica was chosen as their leader. According to Tacitus, they drew inspiration from the example of Arminius, the prince of the Chairs who had driven the Romans out of Germany in AD 9, and their own ancestors who had driven Julius Caesar from Britain. Dio says that at the outset Boudica employed a form of divination, releasing a hair from the folds of her dress and interpreting the direction in which it ran, and invoked Andres, a British goddess of victory. The rebels' first target was Camulodunum, the former Trinovantian capital and, at that time, a Roman colonia. The Roman veterans who had been settled there mistreated the locals, and a temple to the former Emperor Claudius had been erected there at local expense, making the city a focus for resentment. The Roman inhabitants sought reinforcements from the procurator, Catus Decianus, but he sent only 200 auxiliary troops. Boudica's army fell on the poorly defended city and destroyed it, besieging the last defenders in the temple for 2 days before it fell. Archaeologists have shown that the city was methodically demolished. The future governor Quintus Petilius Cerealis, then commanding the Legio IX Hispana, attempted to relieve the city, but suffered an overwhelming defeat. His infantry was wiped out, only the commander and some of his cavalry escaped. The location of this famous destruction of the Legio IX is now claimed by some to be the village of Great Ratting, in Suffolk, which lies in the Stour Valley on the Icknield Way west of Colchester, and by a village in Essex. After this defeat, Catus Decianus fled to Gaul. When news of the rebellion reached him, Suetonius hurried along Watling Street through hostile territory to Londinium. Londinium was a relatively new settlement, founded after the conquest of AD 43, but it had grown to be a thriving commercial centre with a population of travellers, traders, and, probably, Roman officials. Suetonius considered giving battle there, but considering his lack of numbers and chastened by Petilius's defeat, decided to sacrifice the city to save the province. Alarmed by this disaster and by the fury of the province which he had goaded into war by his rapacity, the procurator Catus crossed over into Gaul. Suetonius, however, with wonderful resolution, marched amidst a hostile population to Londinium, which, though undistinguished by the name of a colony, was much frequented by a number of merchants and trading vessels. Uncertain whether he should choose it as a seat of war, as he looked round on his scanty force of soldiers, and remembered with what a serious warning the rashness of Petilius had been punished, he resolved to save the province at the cost of a single town. Nor did the tears and weeping of the people, as they implored his aid, deter him from giving the signal of departure and receiving into his army all who would go with him. Tacitus Londinium was abandoned to the rebels who burnt it down, slaughtering anyone who had not evacuated with Suetonius. Archaeology shows a thick red layer of burnt debris covering coins and pottery dating before AD 60 within the bounds of Roman Londinium, whilst Roman-era skulls found in the Walbrook in 2013 were potentially linked to victims of the rebels. Verulamium was next to be destroyed. In the 3 settlements destroyed, between 70 and 80,000 people are said to have been killed. Tacitus says that the Britons had no interest in taking or selling prisoners, only in slaughter by gibbet, fire, or cross. Dio's account gives more detail, that the noblest women were impaled on spikes and had their breasts cut off and sewn to their mouths, to the accompaniment of sacrifices, banquets, and wanton behavior in sacred places, particularly the groves of Andraste. Romans rally while Boudica's army continued their assault in Verulamium. Suetonius regrouped his forces. According to Tacitus, he amassed a force including his own Legio XIV Gemina, some Vexillationists of the XX Valeria Victrix, and any available auxiliaries. The prefect of Legio II Augusta, Pienius Postumus, stationed near Exeter, ignored the call, and a 4th legion, IX Hispana, had been routed trying to relieve Camulodunum, but nonetheless the governor was able to call on almost 10,000 men. Suetonius took a stand at an unidentified location, probably in the West Midlands somewhere along the Roman road now known as Watling Street, in a defile with a wood behind him, but his men were heavily outnumbered. Dio says that, even if they were lined up 1 deep, they would not have extended the length of Boudica's line. By now the rebel forces were said to have numbered 230,000, however, this number should be treated with skepticism. Dio's account is known only from a late epitome, and ancient sources commonly exaggerate enemy numbers. Boudica exhorted her troops from her chariot, her daughters beside her. Tacitus gives her a short speech in which she presents herself not as an aristocrat avenging her lost wealth, but as an ordinary person, avenging her lost freedom, her battered body, and the abused chastity of her daughters. She said their cause was just, and the deities were on their side. The one legion that had dared to face them had been destroyed. She, a woman, was resolved to win or die. If the men wanted to live in slavery, that was their choice. However, the lack of maneuverability of the British forces, combined with lack of open field tactics to command these numbers, put them at a disadvantage to the Romans, who were skilled at open combat due to their superior equipment and discipline. Also, the narrowness of the field meant that Boudica could put forth only as many troops as the Romans could at a given time. First, the Romans stood their ground and used volleys of pila to kill thousands of Britons who were rushing toward the Roman lines. The Roman soldiers, who had now used up their pila, were then able to engage Boudica's second wave in the open. As the Romans advanced in a wedge formation, the Britons attempted to flee, but were impeded by the presence of their own families, whom they had stationed in a ring of wagons at the edge of the battlefield, and were slaughtered. This is not the first instance of this tactic. The women of the Cimbri, in the Battle of Vercelli against Gaius Marius, were stationed in a line of wagons and acted as a last line of defense. Ariovistus of the Suebi is reported to have done the same thing in his battle against Julius Caesar. Tacitus reports that, according to one report, almost 80,000 Britons fell, compared with only 400 Romans. According to Tacitus in his Annals, Boudica poisoned herself, though in the Agricola, which was written almost 20 years prior, he mentions nothing of suicide and attributes the end of the revolt to Soccordia. Dio says she fell sick and died and then was given a lavish burial, though this may be a convenient way to remove her from the story. Considering Dio must have read Tacitus, it is worth noting he mentions nothing about suicide. Postumus, on hearing of the Roman victory, fell on his sword. Catus Decianus, who had fled to Gaul, was replaced by Gaius Julius Alpinus Classichanus. Suetonius conducted punitive operations, but criticism by Classichanus led to an investigation headed by Nero's freedman Polyclitus. Fearing Suetonius's actions would provoke further rebellion, Nero replaced the governor with the more conciliatory Publius Petronius Turpillianus. The historian Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus tells us the crisis had almost persuaded Nero to abandon Britain. Location of her defeat. The location of Boudica's defeat is unknown. Most historians favour a site in the West Midlands, somewhere along the Roman road now known as Watling Street. Kevin K. Carroll suggests a site close to High Cross in Leicestershire, on the junction of Watling Street and the Fosse Way, which would have allowed the Legio II Augusta, based at Exeter, to rendezvous with the rest of Suetonius's forces, had they not failed to do so. Mandursodum, near the modern town of Atherstone in Warwickshire, has also been suggested, as has the Rampart near Messing in Essex. According to legend, more recently, a discovery of Roman artifacts in King's Norton close to Metchley Camp has suggested another possibility, and a thorough examination of a stretch of Watling Street, between Street, Albans, Boudica's last known location, and the Fosse Way junction has suggested the Cuttle Mill area of Paulsbury in Northamptonshire, which has topography very closely matching that described by Tacitus of the scene of the battle. In 2009 it was suggested that the ISNI were returning to East Anglia along the Icknield Way when they encountered the Roman army in the vicinity of Arbury Bank, Hertfordshire. In March 2010, evidence was published suggesting the site may be located at Churchstowe, Northamptonshire. Historical sources. Tacitus, the most important Roman historian of this period, took a particular interest in Britain as his father-in-law Gnaeus Julius Agricola served there 3 times. Agricola was a military tribune under Suetonius Paulinus, which almost certainly gave Tacitus an eyewitness source for Boudica's revolt. Cassius Dio's account is only known from an epitome, and his sources are uncertain. He is generally agreed to have based his account on that of Tacitus, but he simplifies the sequence of events and adds details, such as the calling in of loans, that Tacitus does not mention. Gildas, in his 6th century De Excidioe Conquestu Britanniae, may have been alluding to Boudica when he wrote, "A treacherous lioness butchered the governors who had been left to give fuller voice and strength to the endeavours of Roman rule."